come to the point of our worship when we study God's Word together. We're looking at those 52 stories this year, and we're getting close to the end of them. In fact, this is sort of the last story in the series, at least as far as the Bible goes, because it's coming from Revelation chapter 21, almost the very end of the very last book. Now, we are going to have those stories about Jesus' birth to finish up our 52 stories that lay a foundation for our faith and practice. I hope that as we've gone through it, that has renewed your faith and confidence in a God who loves you. So we'll be reading these verses again, even though we read them earlier together, verses just 1 through 8. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to that. One of the reasons that we who follow Jesus give thanks, which is not about the bountiful provision which God has given to us and which we've just celebrated at Thanksgiving, is our hope of heaven. It is the reason that our joy can abound even as we encounter increasingly difficult days or struggles. It's what gives us that impetus to carry on and be faithful. We can endure pain in this life because we know that one day we're going to be in a better place where there is no pain, especially if that pain comes as a result of following Jesus. That comes up a lot in the Scriptures. The Apostle Paul said that we are considered such suffering all joy. Elsewise, we might be enticed to escape that pain by turning away from Jesus. We don't often talk about the pain we experience in life because of living in this fallen world, because it just hits too close to home. All of us experience sorrows. We have reasons to shed tears. We have pain. Some more than others. But I was once told that it is those who suffer physical pain in their life that's constantly increasing who probably know the best what it's like to long for the relief that comes whenever Jesus is going to return. Because when he comes, there's going to be a relief. Even Paul talked about that time that creation itself is longing for him to come so that it will be released from the pain that it's suffering. Like those who suffer pain, we want relief. That is why we put our hope in Jesus. He is the only one who can provide the relief that we need. It's also why we put our hope in his return and often talk about, man, we'd like for Jesus to show up sooner than later. I remember as a kid that I prayed that kind of prayer whenever I was looking at a test. Jesus, if you want to show up before the test, that'd be great. Because I didn't want to go through that. But it was more in jest. But when you start suffering, when you start experiencing pain, it moves from jest to that time where you're saying, man, I don't want to suffer anymore. I want that time to come quickly. Desiring relief from some sort of pain has always drawn people to Jesus. It was for relief that the sick and the lame and the blind sought Jesus. It was for relief that the hungry and the thirsty sought Jesus. It was for relief that those denigrated for their occupations, like the tax collectors, sought Jesus. It was for relief that those possessed of evil spirits sought Jesus. But Jesus understood that the last days were coming. A day when those whose sins that were not forgiven would suffer a pain greater than anything else that people could imagine. More than what we could comprehend. And he has come to save them from that pain, to give them relief. So it is from relief from the suffering that is to come, that is at God's judgment, that sinners in general seek relief from Jesus. Or at least we should seek it from him. And so as I was preparing the sermon, it made me think about this question. How much pain do you have to experience in this life to understand that you don't want an eternity full of it? To me, it's an easiest choice. Do you want to live forever in pain? Or do you want to live forever relieved where there is no more pain? I think it's a simple choice. But for a lot of people, it's not. In fact, I've heard a lot of people recently, you probably have too, who've been expressing that they feel that we are now living in the very last of the last days. Have you heard people talking that way? They feel that things are just getting so bad in our world today that Jesus' return has got to be imminent because it just can't get any worse. And the relief that he would bring to the suffering in our world today would be welcome. It's true, as Jesus himself pointed out, that we are living in the last days, but we always have been. Feeling that things are really getting bad might not be a clear indicator that Jesus' return is going to be imminent. After all, there have been seasons in history when believers had felt this way before, including the believers to whom John first published the revelations that he received about the last of the last days. The believers in John the Apostle's day were living under severe persecution that we can't begin to imagine. I mean, some of the emperors actually used believers like candlesticks. They would put them on posts and dip them in tar and light them for their courtyards. We can't begin to understand that sort of atrocity. There were world powers at war. There was a severe famine in Judea. Jerusalem had been turned into rubble by the Romans. The temple had been destroyed. The city had been destroyed. They were essentially exiles. They must have been thinking, how bad can things get before Jesus comes back? They longed for his return to end the suffering. The hope of Jesus' return is the hope of experiencing a relief from the ramifications of our sins committed and Satan's rebellion enacted. It is the hope for that day when both of these enemies will be defeated and everything will finally get better. So let me remind you that the Apostle John received these revelations of how God's plan would unfold in the last days while he was exiled for his faith, while he was on the Isle of Patmos, which is in the southern part of the Aegean Sea. He wrote them down as instructed by the Lord and distributed them in hopes of bringing followers of Jesus much needed comfort and assurance and encouragement and guidance. Unfortunately, since his revelations are recorded in what we call prophetic language, that is, language that makes use of earthly images to talk about heavenly things that we might not otherwise understand, it has sparked a lot of debate about the exact times and the exact sequences that the last days will unfold and arrive and where these events will take place. Even when John speaks about these future events in what seems to be granular detail, the images he uses are so far removed from our earthly and daily experiences that it almost comes across like a fantasy novel. But rather than being one that's fictional, it's one that is prophetic. It reveals the future for those who can understand its mysteries. And that's the problem, isn't it? There are so many different ways that his revelation can be understood that it's brought more confusion and anxiety about the last days than comfort. And as a result, many who could be aided and encouraged by the book of Revelations just tend to avoid it. I remember taking a class on it and after learning all the different ways that you could understand his visions, and by the end of it I just kept thinking, man, this is a mess. How do you know what it says? If this one could be right or that one could be right, there's like 6 different ways that you can understand the overall theme of it. And so for a lot of people, they're just like, well, it's just the story of God wins in the end. And there's all these arguments, I'm a premillennialist, or I'm a postmillennialist, or I'm an amillennialist, and that's how you understand things. And I just got so frustrated with all the confusion that I just started saying, I'm a panmillennialist. It's just going to pan out in the end. God's going to take care of it. I don't have to figure it out. But there's so much richness in it that we shouldn't just toss it aside. It really was written for our encouragement. So let's begin our study of just these 8 verses in chapter 21 by reviewing the general outline of John's book of Revelations. I'm not going to go into detail, but I want to give you the general flow of this story. John begins by affirming that it was the resurrected and reigning Christ who came to him and showed him the vision of what was to come, and charged him to write down what he would see and hear, and then he was to send it to the 7 churches, which he names. John is also told that what he is about to see will not only reveal what was happening then, of course he says happening now, but what will happen later. Each of those 7 churches receive a very specific letter, and we get to hear all about them. They address their specific situation. They are filled with commendations and criticisms and counsel and challenges to stay faithful until the very end. Then John sees a vision of heaven in which Jesus is worshipped and affirmed by saints and angelic beings who proclaim that he is the only one worthy to usher in the last days by breaking the 7 seals that bind together a scroll that contains the word of life. Each seal unleashes a judgment on the earth, but there is a pause after the 6th seal is broken, in which Jesus again is worshipped by all of heaven for what he alone can do. And then the 7th seal is opened, which unleashes the blasts of 7 trumpets. Each blast sends another wave of God's judgment on the earth. And after the 6th trumpet is blown, there's another pause. And when the 7th trumpet is sounded, all of heaven again worships and praises God. Then John sees Satan and all who are under his power and influence rise up to take their final stand against God. The resulting war is as dramatic as it is devastating, culminating in 7 angels pouring out 7 bowls of God's judgment upon them, which is described in what seems to be detail. Yet they remain defiant and unrepentant and determined to embrace ungodly ways. But their complete destruction is announced by a great angel, and then that great angel destroys their stronghold. It is then that Jesus appears and makes his return to destroy his enemies and initiates a 1,000-year reign, after which Satan is finally and fully defeated and cast into the lake of fire along with those who followed him. Praise erupts from all over heaven, and that's when John sees a new earth and a new heaven and a new Jerusalem descend from heaven. All things are made new, we are told. That is, it is made better than it was in the beginning, because there is no chance that sin will enter into this new creation. The first few verses that we read from chapter 21 earlier in our service zoom in on what is to come, the very last of the last days. We don't have to understand exactly how it will happen or understand everything about John's vision of it or even its timing, but we are to trust that God will bring about his promises just as he revealed them to John. So let's take a look at some of the highlights from what we hear from John's revelation about the last of the last days. I think that doing so will serve to encourage you instead of confuse you about our hope of heaven. At least I hope that it does. So let's read these first 2 verses again. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. What a galactic perspective. John is able to see a new heaven and a new earth. Now, when John speaks of a new heaven, he wasn't talking about a new throne room for God. He was talking about the atmosphere that surrounds the earth. You have to remember that they use the term heaven to talk about three different things. The sky is where the birds and clouds reside. They call that the first heaven. The space where the stars reside, they refer to as the second heaven. And the place where God resides, they refer to as the third heaven. That's why the Apostle Paul spoke about getting a glimpse of God's residence as being taken up or caught up to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12:2. John, in this vision, is seeing earth and sky 2.0, the earth and the heavens that surround it. To me, the important thing to notice is that the first heaven and the first earth, the one that we are on right now, pass away. And that term for pass away is the same term we would use to talk about someone who dies. Just as we will die and receive a new resurrected body fit for eternity, so the first heaven and earth die as well. But instead of receiving a resurrected body, it's replaced with this new one that comes down from heaven. And yes, this time John is referring from that place where God resides by using that term heaven. But John notices something odd about this new earth. There's going to be no sea on it. I don't know if that caught your attention. No one fully understands what John really meant because sea was used a lot of different ways in the Bible. It could simply mean that there are no large bodies of water on this new earth. That would be the simple way to understand it. That would definitely make it look rather different than our great big blue marble that is covered in water. Some 71% of the surface is water. But this new one says there is no sea. But sea could also be a way to say that there is no evil present on this new earth. No one is going to rise up out of it to tempt anyone and start the whole cycle all over again. Bible scholars claim that this might be the best way to understand no sea because in Revelation 13:1, John revealed that the first beast came up out of the sea. And to support this understanding, it's pointed out that when Isaiah spoke prophetically, speaking of future events, he spoke of the sea when referring to people who are evil and their origin. But John just doesn't explain to us what no sea means. He simply moves on to the next thing, this new Jerusalem descending from heaven. Not the one in Palestine being raised from the rubble, but a new one descending from where God resides, a heavenly one that is put on this new earth that becomes the city of God. John describes this new Jerusalem as being adorned in the same way that a bride is adorned for her husband on their wedding day. But John doesn't really tell us what that means. We are left to assume that this new place is pure and beautiful and dressed in white and is a delight to behold as a bride is. It is everything that the husband desires and longs to be with for all of eternity. Then John moves from seeing things to hearing things. Verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. A lot of things are dying. This is probably the part of Revelation that most of us know most about. We envision this place. When people are approaching death and they're going through pain, it's the part that we often bring up. You know, you can look forward to that time when there's no tears and there's no sorrows, right? The tabernacle was the tent of meeting. Tabernacle just means tent. That was erected so God could be with his people whenever they were in their wanderings. It was how God was present with them. He would fill it up, smoke would pour over it, and they could learn and get direction from him. And John hears that God's tabernacle shall dwell among them. And the way John expresses it, it brings to mind the messianic title that was given to Jesus at his birth, Emmanuel, which means God is with us. It is because of what God does in his Son Jesus, who makes himself present with us. He is this tabernacle. And what he has done through Jesus, finally and fully, his people can populate this new city, and they can be with him and live with him and enjoy the kind of fellowship again that Adam and Eve began with. We get to have it finally. It's restored. It's made new. But things are going to be radically different in this new tabernacle. It says that God himself is going to console us about what we have experienced in the past. He is the one who's going to wipe away our tears. And that can only happen because there's going to be no reason to cry anymore. There'll be no sorrows. Can you imagine a place? No sorrows. No death. No mourning. No losing people we love. No pain in this place that's going to cause us to hurt with agony. Jesus has gone. He has prepared it for us. He's made it ready for us. And sin and its ramifications are no part of it. That which was a part of the first earth, part of the first things, passes away. It dies. And I'm thankful it does not resurrect. What a glorious day that's going to be. That's why there is this emphasis, I think, as John tells this story of what is to come, of God making all things new. This promise first shows up in Isaiah chapter 60 through 66, which refers to a future time whenever God is going to reign. It's called in Isaiah the age of the Spirit. It's called the age of the Messiah. It's called the age of righteousness. This new age, and if you're ever going to be a new ager, this is the only kind of new age I recommend. It's a new age that Jesus inaugurated at his first coming and will consummate at his second coming. Who doesn't long to live in a place like that? I mean, how much of heaven do we really need to know about other than all the sorrows that we experience in this life are not going to be there? It's going to be a great place. But then John says in verses 5 and 6, and he who sits on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And he said, right, for these words are faithful and true. And then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of water of life without cost. The Alpha and the Omega is a title used for God in Isaiah 44:6 and in Revelation 1:8. However, I think it's significant to point out that this title is now being used by John in this revelation for the Son, for the Messiah, for Jesus. He also uses this title in reference to Jesus in 1:17 and in 22:13. I'm bringing this up not because I expect you to go look it up, but just to say there are examples of the apostles using titles for God found in the Old Testament as titles for Jesus in the New One. There is this hint at the Trinity of the Father and the Son and the Spirit being one in the way these titles are used. And that's going to be experienced in this new place. Jesus was there when things got started. He's present with us now, and he is going to see it to the end and bring it to its final conclusion. In a similar way, Jesus is also called the first and the last, the beginning and the end, and he who is and was and which is to come. I take comfort from knowing that Jesus is going to be with us through all this, that he's going to be present, that it is his plan and he is going to see it to the end. I know how projects sometimes get started. Sometimes I'm good at getting something started, but not always good at getting it finished. And there's comfort from knowing that Jesus, what he's getting started, is going to be completed. And it's going to be done right. And then comes verse 7. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Man, what a great promise. But it's a promise only for those who overcome. And that makes me a little nervous. But don't worry. Overcoming does not mean making it through by your own strength, making it through all of the judgments that are poured out and described by John in the pages of Revelation, that you're going to have to make it through those days and endure to the very end, and then you can enjoy heaven. This is something that's coming that's free to us, as we read in those earlier verses. It means overcoming the evil one by putting your trust in God alone and staying faithful to him. That we can do. When we follow Jesus, we depend on him to keep his promise to be our strength when we are weak, to fill us with his power, to win for us the victory that's beyond our capability over sin and death. We lean on him to do what we're unable to do for ourselves. He is the one who can do what is impossible. When we follow Jesus, we overcome Satan's schemes. We overcome the pain and the suffering of sin, because otherwise we might avoid it. We might try to find relief from it. When we trust Jesus, he says, don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of that for you. Yes, you're suffering. Yes, you want relief, but leave that in my hands. I'll take care of it. We overcome Satan's deceptions and his lies to us about ourselves and about the world and about God himself. Our overcoming is not how we earn a place in heaven. It's the result of trusting Jesus and receiving what he does for us without cost. That doesn't mean that following Jesus is easy, right? The scriptures are full of examples about how following Jesus is costly. Jesus said that we have to take up our cross daily when we follow him. And he wasn't talking about little struggles. He was talking about taking up your cross. People will put on the cross because of their faith in God and their trusting of him. That's what that taking up your cross is about. It's about putting your trust fully and wholly in Jesus despite what anyone does to you over it. But those who can trust Jesus, those who can put their faith in him, will endure to the end. I like that. It's comforting and encouraging to me. And then we get this little bit here in verse 8, our last verse. What about the people who don't put their faith in Jesus? But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all the liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. That's frightening to me. I'm going to ask our music team if you begin coming forward. I'll be honest, I don't like verse 8. I never liked verse 8. If it were up to me to write God's revelation, I probably wouldn't include it. I want everyone to be saved. I don't like that this story ends with people not being saved. I kind of want a Disney ending. But Jesus is quite clear that not everyone wants to be saved. They reject him. They reject his offer. In fact, we're told that it's the majority that will not be saved. I don't like that either. Jesus loves them just as much as he loves you. Jesus died for their sins just as much as he died for yours. Jesus came to save them just as much as he came to save you. How hard it must be for God to be rejected by those that he loves so dearly. Instead of being set free from pain and sorrow of living in this fallen world, they're going to be cast into this lake of fire and brimstone, which is the second death, which doesn't bring an end to their suffering, but extends it forever. It's from this second death that we all need to be saved. And that's the good news, right? That's the culminating good news that we proclaim, that we've heard through all the stories that we've been studying over this past year. The good news that God knows our sorrows and he knows our problems. He knows the pain that's in store for us. And he has prepared a way to save us from it. He loves you that much. And that is good news. We're going to have a hymn of dedication or invitation.